Welcome back to Salam Media. You're still tuned in to us. We're coming to you live from our headquarters here in Johannesburg, keeping you company in a very chilly morning. If you're in Johannesburg, I'm not sure about the other parts of the country. The interview that you just heard now, before we went to that ad break, it was a recap of a really, really interesting interview featuring Naledi Pandor. They're focusing on Gaza and South Africa's role in the discourse. You can go back to our podcast and to our various media channels if you didn't get the gist of it or didn't get the gist of the whole interview. And we're going to be moving on now to a very pressing issue, the issue of corruption, which is very topical here in South Africa. I don't think a week goes by before there's a huge corruption case, or someone in government or someone in public service is accused of corruption. And an interesting one is the one that we'll be touching on with advocate Stephanie Fick. Is according to Corruption Watch's latest report, it shows that Gauteng and the Western Cape account for 70% of the country's corruption cases. We'll be chatting a bit about this with advocate Stephanie Fick, who's joining us via StreamYard. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Salam Media.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. The issue of corruption, a very, very big one, in South Africa, particularly in our metros. Looking at the stat that Gauteng and the Western Cape account for 70% of the country's corruption, does it paint a picture, for the people of South Africa to understand just how rampant corruption is? What does this tell us about, the battle that we're fighting with against corruption in the country?
Yeah, unfortunately, it does not paint a good picture. I think, looking at this report from Corruption Watch, their annual report, taking into consideration the corruption perception index, we were also lower down than we used to be. All speaks to just the problem we have with corruption. But I mean, it doesn't take a genius. Just if you look at the social injustices currently in our country, I think hopefully everybody realizes that come 29 May, we need to vote for change. If it wasn't for, civil society, I think society would have been in a more dire, is that how you would say it? More dire situation, because thank goodness there are society organizations that looks after, the people that are really struggling. But looking at everything, if you look at it high level, what do people say? A helicopter view is we are in a troubling state when it comes to corruption. And I think what is most troubling is that we don't seem to see movement in the right direction. We hear a lot of the right noise. We hear government saying we need to do something about corruption. But then when you come back and you look at these reports, you see, but we are still having trouble. There's still trouble brewing, which have an enormous impact on each and every South African.
And you just mentioned that we keep hearing the right noises coming from government. What is one of the factors that you'd say is hindering our fight against corruption in South Africa? I mean, each and every week, if not each and every day, these stats come out, whether it's metros or it's little municipalities, essentially in the middle of nowhere. There's always stories like this coming out. We seem to know where the problem is. We seem to know where it hurts, but there doesn't seem to be any remedial action. What's stopping us? Is it a weak justice system? Is it a weak what's wrong? Why can't we see people in orange overalls?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. So firstly, off the bat, I want to say I think it's political will. I think there has to be political will to resource, for example, the entities that's responsible for holding to account. So let's start with who is underfunded. And what comes to mind first is the police. The police needs to have the ability to investigate not only, stuff that we have always been talking about, state capture, corruption, etc., but also just our high crime rate. And so that's number one. NPA, their ability to prosecute crimes, corruption, and any other crime that comes across their desk. And I think if we look at priorities, the fact that, for example, our Blue Light Brigade, our the people looking after our politicians, their budget in relation to, for example, the NPA and the police are, just screams that, okay, it's more important for us to look after the MMCs and ministers than it is to give money to the police in order to look after the safety of us, again, ordinary citizens. So it's political will to effect change. I think we've also seen, ATA has released some reports with regards to Parliament, the fact that Parliament is really lacking in their ability to hold to account executive. So that sends again the message about if Parliament is not going to hold the executive to account, the executive then continues, and that also sends a message to everybody, saying to what degree one can commit certain crimes without facing accountability. So there is no accountability in certain aspects. If you're talking about, for example, how many individuals has been linked to corrupt activities, etc. But then when it comes to Parliament, they are either committee members, still MPs, etc. I'm sometimes wondering, what does our kids think about the adults, in the sense that they see how people are getting away with certain things, and that creates this narrative, but it is okay. In order for you to be successful, you have to be corrupt. So that to me, would be point number 3, is that, just the education part of it, that somewhere along the line, there needs to be enough accountability so that we can learn that corruption is not the only way. And without, the political will, without creating the environment where we can have economic growth, what you also have is that you have an enormous amount of people in South Africa living in poverty, which then creates, I think, a scenario where, they can't lose anything. So if there's an opportunity to be corrupt, if there's an opportunity to commit crime, they will. I mean, can you blame a mother that has to feed her children for committing a crime? So if we don't create an economic environment where we can help South Africa grow, you're not going to solve the economic situation where we are and solve the social injustices. And therefore, it is also, it's this vicious circle. But just in summary, I think it's political will in order to hold to account and making sure that there's transparency and that we, in actual fact, eradicate corruption and not just talk about it.
And I think, maybe you can answer this for me. Do you think there's an understanding from us, the public, that just how much corruption takes away, from, the people that are living in poverty, and which are in the majority in the country? When you hear of certain billions being stolen, this literally translates, to people that, are not going to have a house, to a school that's not going to be built, to a public clinic that's not going to be built, or a road that you use and complain about that there's potholes on it that's not going to be fixed. Is there that understanding? And if we did have that understanding, why are we not angry enough?
That's actually a very good question. Why aren't we angry enough? And I think that the saving grace of South Africa is going to be its angry citizens, citizenry, active citizenry, standing up and realizing that we do have the power to change it. And that, this whole idea of Batupele, people first, and not party political rhetoric and party comes first and all of that, because that's a problem we see in Parliament. A very, very good question, because I always, when we were dealing with Dudu Mnyeni, she was declared a Lingman director, and this is in the talks about SAA and just the maladministration and corruption that was going on there. And talking about SAA and the fact that it received so many bailouts, and that there's still, it's been again in the news because we can't seem to get the deal with, to help SAA become a better SOE, and government not letting go of an SOE like SAA. I'm wondering whether people understand why the outcry. Because if you are poor, you are struggling to feed your family, whether you care about SAA. But here is the thing. The fact that SAA is still an SOE, and the fact that government needs to bail it out because of, I'm open to be corrected, but sheer maladministration and corruption means, like you have said, that there's less money in the kitty in order to make sure that we build new schools, that, not just provide electricity, because everybody is struggling with load shedding when we have it, but provide electricity to communities that still do not have access to electricity, water, clean water. We are seeing that our water infrastructure is going to create an enormous amount of problems. And that people do not have clean water. And again, this whole issue of access to water. And that goes for everything, like you've mentioned, building of schools, hospitals. We are talking about an NHI that we cannot afford at this point. Can't we just look at how money is spent in our health sector in order to make it better for people, that visits hospitals? How many people need to sit in rows in order to just get ordinary medicines? And all of that goes back to the fact that we cannot seem to plug the holes of corruption. A while back, there was a very good example. Someone made a TikTok video or something about a bucket full of holes with water pouring in, and then all the water, spewing all over the show through the holes. And that is corruption. You pour the water, and if you don't plug the holes of corruption, you will never have enough funds in order to make sure that, the social divide, the social injustices that there are in South Africa are then looked after. You really get the impression that there's an elite that is making sure that, tenders are given to certain people. And it's not just about tenders that are awarded irregularly. It is about tenders being awarded irregularly, and then the work does not get done. And I wonder what is the answer, why people are not more angry. But I think that come 29 May, again, we come right back to the elections. People really need to think about what they need, and, what do they need in order to create, just a better South Africa in terms of more services to the people. And then go make your cross. And I've heard again someone saying, I'm not going to vote because it's not making a difference. No, it will. It will. If you vote and say to the politicians, we are no longer giving you the power over us, we have the power. It is high time that we really take charge in order to effect change.
No, definitely. And you touched a bit on tenders. I think when we speak corruption, I think the first thing, and I think maybe this is because of a reputation that they built for themselves, people always assume we're talking about government. Forgetting the fact that you have a private sector, which God, if we understood just how severe corruption is at the level of private sector, because I think it's impossible that government would just operate in silos and just going rampant with the corruption without the private sector being involved. Are we focusing enough on the private sector and just how much they're contributing to the corruption problem in South Africa? I mean, looking at the Western Cape and Johannesburg, these are the two biggest, municipalities, metros, provinces, and I'm sure they're giving businesses out to private sector. I'm sure they have some kind of dealings, and there's no way that all of this is just happening in the hands and eyes of public service and government without the private sector being involved? Are we holding them accountable enough for their role in the issue of corruption in South Africa?
No, probably not. Probably not. You know what? What is interesting? Corruption. If you look at the charged corruption, it requires two people, two
Mm-hmm.
companies, two bodies, because you can't commit corruption by yourself. So it's interesting is that how many corruption are there between government entities and how many corruption are there between government and private sector? And I think you will agree with me, without being scientific about it, that one gets the impression that there's an enormous amount of corruption between government and private entities. Don't get me wrong. There's also corruption between private entities, one a company doing business with another company. From our perspective as an organization, because of our mandate, because for us, it's very important to make sure that taxpayers' money, in other words, each and every person in this country is a taxpayer. If you buy something at a shop, you're a taxpayer. So that's everybody. You contribute to the kitty, which then has to be distributed. Because of our mandate, we want to make sure that the money that is spent by government is spent appropriately. So so we tend to look at how government spends our money. But of course, we have to take cognizance of the fact that corruption is successful because of the two parties. But I still feel that, again, eradicating corruption needs to come from the top. And if our government institutions is advocating for and actually implementing, we are not going to commit corruption, that your corruption in your private sector is going to be less because there's not an opportunity for them to then be corrupt. And it is important who, we trust government to spend money on our behalf. And I trust less private sector. I mean, for them, it's about business and making money. But yes, I do think that because there's this two-party thing going on when you talk about corruption, is that there's not one, both parties are guilty. The one is not more guilty than the other. It is only this thing about, we do expect government to spend our money in the best interest of everybody in South Africa. But that goes again to what we've just discussed, is why isn't private sector and government being held accountable? Why do we see climbing numbers? Why do we, if you look at the CPI index, at the Corruption Perception Index of South Africa, it is, and that's very interesting what Corruption Watch has said in their report, it is if we have a straight line, it is as if there's no real improvement. We are around 43, 44, 43, 45, I think was our highest. So why don't we see a spike? And in other words, we are better in the perception of corruption in the country. So where is the problem? And I want to say, I think it is about just the perception that if you want to do business, you need to be corrupt. If you want to do business with government, you need to be corrupt. And I think that is what we need to change. Government needs to close the taps, make sure that there's no leakage. And I think if government takes the lead but we are not going to tolerate corruption, I think the private sector will have no choice. But let's put aside what we as an organization, of course, we concentrate on government. If the private sector comes to the same conclusion and saying, we are going to eradicate corruption, we are going to be proud, corrupt-free institutions, companies, etc. I also think that will create also that, if government can't do business with private sector and private sector ensure that it's corrupt-free, maybe we can work towards a corrupt-free society. So again, what do we see is that these two parties, we need we need buy-in from both government and the private sector in order to, eradicate corruption. So it's interesting to see the dynamics when we talk about corruption. And it is sad that we can have this type of conversation as who is to blame, and
Mm.
that the party that is most negatively impacted by this is actually not part of this
Either. Yeah.
dynamic between a corrupt government and corrupt private sector.
Mm. And just lastly, before I let you go, it goes without saying that the situation is unsustainable. If we gonna save the country as we claim to, have the willingness to, something has to give. That's why I want to know: are there any examples across the world where a country's corruption problem was as out of hand, like ours is, and they implemented, I don't know, any kind of remedial actions that we can look at and say maybe we can take a page out of their script and try to implement those? Are there examples across the world, any country that was horrible when it comes to handling corruption, and a few years down the line they fixed it, they got their house in order, and things are running back to normal again?
I think the first example that I have read about, I think, was Taiwan, that had an enormous amount of problems with corruption, and they turned it around. And that was really just political will to do it. Implementing what you're talking about, making sure that you have ethical leadership. If you talk about CEOs, board members, chairpersons of boards in South Africa, there's a lot of change that you can effect in order to ensure that our state-owned entities, for example, are better managed. I'm just looking at, Corruption Watch's report, and if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, Seychelles, for example, is a very good example. Cabo Verde, Botswana, Rwanda, who
Mm,
had huge human rights atrocities happen there, are 53 out of 100. So that's above 50, which is extremely good. So, what do you take from there? If you have the will, you can do this. It doesn't
mm,
matter what happened in the past. Now, talking about our past, I think despite what happened in the past, there's a lot of things that, because of where we come from, need to change.
mm,
We were handed, from the apartheid era, we were handed quite a few problems that will need to change. And that, the question is, does 30 years of democracy, is that enough in order to change some of those things? And the answer is no. We will need more time. But,
mm,
we're not going to create a better democracy if we do not eradicate corruption. Because, funny enough, Transparency International and with this report, they also look at corruption and then justice and injustices. And you
mm,
can have a look. Think about a country, even in South Africa, where corruption is rife, your injustices is also higher, because we struggle with gender-based violence. That is not going to change if the police is not getting more resources in order to deal with it. It's not going to change if we can't affect, I want to say, training or whatever, so that we can teach our children, from a young age, that is not the way to deal with, problems in a community. And
mm,
that, what is gender-based violence, for example, linked to? And I think it's about the social injustices as part of the problem. So if you look at, for example, these countries, that there's hope, and if you have the will, and if you implement what you are talking about, us as a country can eradicate corruption. And I have to say this: I think just the ability to have this discussion with you this morning, that
mm,
you have the ability to create this platform, journalism, the fact that we do have civil society organizations. And again, I want to say, without them, I think we would have had problems. And then an independent judiciary. Those are the pillars, I think, that are extremely important, and that is South Africa's saving grace. And
Mm.
that because of our voices, we are able to say, but we need to work on a very young democracy in order to make sure that South Africa, I want to say, survive this corruption pandemic. Yeah, so I think that there is hope. And if a country like Rwanda can be 43 out of 100, can score 53
50.
out of 100, we can do it as well.
No, definitely. I think we're going to leave it there, Stephanie. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and I hope we catch up soon again.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
There you have it, Stephanie Fick, the executive director at Outer, chatting to us there about the latest report that shows that the Gauteng province and the Western Cape account for 70% of the country's corruption cases. Imagine those are just two, 70%. So, yeah. Really, really, really concerning stuff there. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be doing another recap of one of the really, really amazing, wonderful interviews that we conducted during the course of Ramadan. We'll be speaking to Aisha Kaji there. She was in dialogue with Al Jazeera correspondent Yumna El Said. They were delving into the current state of affairs in Gaza from a journalist perspective and the significance of media coverage in such circumstances. So tune in for that in-depth interview that gives insight on what's currently happening on the ground in Gaza, coming from a journalist that's covering all the injustices that are happening in that part of the world. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, you'll be listening to Aisha Kaji and Al Jazeera correspondent Yumna El Said.